Hello and greetings from UB. On behalf of the Office of Alumni Engagement and the UB School of Management, we are delighted you are able to join us for today's webinar presentation. My name is Christy Fields and I manage the Alumni Careers and Lifelong Learning program here at UB. I am also joined today by my wonderful colleague Joy Rona, who will be assisting and monitoring any questions you may have today. So we both are very excited you are able to join us. We do hope you and your family also continue to stay well. It is my honor to welcome today's featured presenter, UB alumna Marianne Rogers. Marianne is a clinical associate professor in the School of Management's Organization and Human Resources Department and principally teaches communication and organizational behavior courses on the undergraduate, MBA, and the executive MBA levels. In today's webinar, Marianne will address some ways that emotions and moods manifest in the workplace, along with ideas for creating a stronger emotional culture. We are going to leave some time during today's webinar for Q&A. If you have any questions during the presentation, please submit them through your GoToWebinar taskbar. There's a question section on your screen, and you can chat those to us at any time. In addition, we will be recording today's session, and we will send you all a copy within the next 24 hours. With that said, it's my pleasure to turn it over to our featured presenter, Marianne Rogers.
Okay, thank you, Christy and Joy. Good afternoon, everyone. Happy Monday. It's really good of you to be here. Just kind of an interesting perspective on this. We were thinking about topics that would be good for pandemic world, and I knew that this was coming along in June 8th, and by that time, most people would have figured out how to work from home, which was going to be the original topic. And now, in light of world and country events, it seems kind of funny to be talking about just something a little different that doesn't really tie into the crises that we're in. And but I still think it's a luxury, and maybe we can just use this session as a distraction, and maybe learn a little something and reflect upon our own moods and our own moods and emotions. So let me just jump in here. A little history before we get to the heart of it. So until recently, most organizations wouldn't really allow employees to express emotions, as they thought that they weren't relevant to rationality and what was going on in the workplace. And though a lot of managers knew that emotions were an inseparable part of everyday life and every person, they still tried hard to make their organizations emotion-free. And another explanation of that is that a lot of managers simply held the belief that emotions were just disruptive, and a lot of them thought that strong negative emotions, especially emotions like anger, interfered with an employee's ability to work effectively. So many managers in the past rarely viewed emotions as positive or constructive forces. And for sure, we all know that emotions exhibited at the wrong time can certainly hinder performance, but there's no denying that employees do bring emotions to work every day, and so it's worth taking a look at the role that they play in the workplace. Here's a little agenda today for our short session. I'm going to begin with defining what an emotional culture is, and we can move down to how to have your managers create one, or if you're a manager, get you thinking about that as well. Why does this matter? Well, there's an understanding that emotions can make a difference in a lot of areas in the organization. For example, decision making. Researchers are finding that moods and emotions have important effects on decision making. For example, positive moods and emotions seem to help people make sound decisions. People in good moods are more likely than others to use heuristics, or what's known as rules of thumb, little shortcuts, to help them make decisions quickly. How about creativity? So people in good moods tend to be more creative than people in bad moods. They tend to produce more ideas and more options. And it seems that people experiencing positive moods or emotions are more flexible and open in their thinking, which may explain why they are more creative. Let's think about motivation. Several studies are highlighting the importance of moods and emotions on motivation. One in particular found that giving people performance feedback influences their mood, which in turn influences their motivation. So it's a really good cycle that can exist, in which a positive mood causes people to be more creative, which then leads to positive feedback from others observing the work, and that's seen to be a good thing. And then there's leadership. You likely realize this already, that effective leaders rely on emotional appeals to help convey their messages. In fact, the expression of emotions in speeches is often the critical element that makes us accept or reject leaders' messages. Successful corporate successful corporate executives know emotional content is critical if employees are to buy into their vision of the company's future and accept change. Leaders who focus on inspirational goals also generate greater optimism and enthusiasm in employees, leading to more positive social interactions with coworkers and customers. So lots of good stuff there. Okay, so when people talk about corporate culture, they're typically referring to what's known as cognitive culture. And cognitive culture is the shared intellectual values and norms and artifacts and assumptions that serve as a guide for the group to thrive. Corporate culture sets the tone for how employees think and behave at work. For instance, how customer focused, how innovative, how team oriented, or how competitive they should be. Cognitive culture is undeniably important to an organization's success, but it's only part of the story. You are probably completely aware of what your organization's cognitive culture is. If I had to ask you what it was, you would be able, off the top of your head, to name it. Maybe it's like a focus on quality, maybe it's a focus on employee satisfaction, whatever it is. You have an awareness of your cognitive culture. What's a little bit harder to define, though, is what's known as emotional culture. And this means the shared affective values, norms, artifacts, and assumptions that govern which emotions people have at work and which ones they are better off suppressing. So what do they feel free enough to let people see, and which ones do they work on keeping hidden? The key here is, when we're thinking about these items, the key distinction here is thinking versus feelings. And the two types of culture here are transmitted differently if you think about it. Cognitive culture is often conveyed verbally, where emotional culture tends to be conveyed through nonverbal cues such as body language and facial expression. So if you're not paying attention, it's a lot easier to miss these things. Now, despite a resurgence in scholarship on the way that emotion shapes people's behaviors at work, we find still that emotional culture is rarely managed as deliberately as cognitive culture is, and most of the time it's ignored and not managed at all. And this becomes a problem because we find that emotional culture influences things, again, like employee satisfaction, burnout, teamwork, and then even harder measures such as financial performance and absenteeism. So it's a very good idea for organizations to take this concept seriously. Okay, so this is a good time to think about what is underneath emotional culture. So what really are emotions and moods? Well, they involve three things that are closely intertwined, and you see them on the screen. And they are affect, moods, and emotion. Affect is a generic term that covers a broad range of feelings that people experience, including both emotions and moods. Emotions are intense feelings directed at someone or something. Moods are less intense feelings and often don't always arise without specific events acting as a stimulus. So what you see on the screen shows the characteristics of each and the relationship between them. Emotions are reactions to a person or an event. You show your emotions when you're happy about something, angry at someone, or afraid of something perhaps. Moods, in contrast, aren't usually directed at a person or an event. Emotions can turn into moods when you lose focus on the event or object that started the feeling. So as the slide shows, again, affect is a broad term that encompasses emotions and moods. And I'll just leave that there for a second because there's a lot to digest. So let me just give you half a minute to make sure that you can read through all of that. Might not have had an opportunity to think about moods and emotions this way before and how they're related and how these three items are intertwined. Okay, So one way to classify emotions is by whether they are positive or negative. Positive emotions express a favorable evaluation of feeling, and negative emotions, on the other hand, express the opposite. So when we group emotions into positive and negative categories, they become mood states because we are now looking at them more generally instead of isolating one particular emotion. So when you look at the slide, you can see that excited is a pure marker of high positive affect, whereas boredom is a pure marker of low positive affect. Nervous is a pure marker of high negative affect. Relaxed is a true marker of low negative affect. So we can think of positive affect as a mood dimension consisting of positive emotions such as excitement and cheerfulness at the high end, and then boredom and tiredness at the low. High negative affect is a mood dimension consisting of nervousness, stress, and anxiety, and then relaxation is at the low end. And I put this last sentence in particularly because what got me thinking about choosing this as a topic was I was in the high negative affect quadrant, or part of this pie, when the lockdown first started, working at home, adjusting, again, listening to too much news, just, feeling these spikes of anxiousness that were really quite new to me. I know we all have our moments, and we all have easy and more difficult times in our lives, but I consider myself a fairly well-keeled person, and I just was surprised to be feeling this high negative affect. I didn't have a word for it, so it's been really valuable to go through some of this literature. And just like anything else, once you get a language for understanding something that's bothering you, it just becomes a lot easier to cope with. And, it makes perfect sense. I would imagine that some people that are on this webinar felt the same thing. So I can assure you that high negative affect in the middle of a pandemic is pretty normal for most people. Okay, a few other things. You might be wondering where emotions and moods come from. Let's take a look at some of the primary influences, with the first one being personality. Moods and emotions have a trait component, T-R-A-I-T, have a trait component. People have built-in tendencies to experience certain moods and emotions more frequently than do others. People also experience the same emotions with different intensities. So some may be easily moved to anger, where others are relatively distant and unemotional in the same set of circumstances. You can probably think of a lot of people in your life, just the way they handle stress, how they handle anger. Some people are just cool as cucumbers, and some people are, impulsive and excitable. And that's just the nature of having different personalities in our society. So what we're talking about here, this reflects a difference in affect intensity, or how strongly people experience their emotion. We can also consider days of the week and times of the day. Here on this slide, we see that people tend to be in their worst mood early in the week and in their best moods later on the week. I think if we were to slap a label on this, we could call it the Sunday scaries, where anxiety starts to set in on Sunday evenings and so forth, and mood changes. And early in the week, workers tend to have the highest negative effect and the lowest positive effect. Later in the week, employees tend to have their highest positive effect and then the lowest negative effect. Had I known this morsel of information before I signed on to this date, delivering a webinar at noon on a Monday, I would have moved to a noon on a Friday. So I don't know what your effect is at the moment. Hopefully, through this webinar, again, you're getting a fix on your affect, and getting a little bit of a boost from gaining more information. We can also think about time of the day, and it's funny because people oftentimes consider themselves either morning people or evening people. And however, from what the research suggests is that negative affect appears to show little fluctuation throughout the day, regardless of what time people go to bed at night or get up in the morning. Levels of positive affect tend to peak around the halfway point between waking and sleeping. All right, a few other things. This is my favorite, weather. A lot of people believe that mood is tied to the weather. Some researchers are finding, though, that the data indicate that people do not report a better mood on a bright and sunny day, or conversely, a worse mood on a dark and rainy day. I could not believe this. A colleague of mine told me about this about a year or two ago, and I simply did not believe him, but it turns out his point of view on this is really becoming backed up by research. You would just think on a nice day you'd feel better, not necessarily the case from the data that's being presented. This is an illusory correlation, explaining why people tend to think nice weather improves their mood. An illusory correlation occurs when people associate two events that in reality have no connection. As you might imagine, stressful daily events at work negatively affect moods. The effects of stress also build over time. Mounting levels of stress can worsen our moods, and we experience more negative emotions. Although sometimes and some people thrive on stress, most of us find that it takes a toll on our mood, especially over the long term. A couple more things here. Social activities. For most people, social activities increase mood, but have little effect on a negative mood. So it's important to note that the type of social activity is what matters here. Research suggests that activities that are physical, like skiing or hiking with friends, or something informal like going to a party, are more strongly associated with increases in positive mood, probably no surprise, as opposed to events that are more formal, like, still social, but having to attend a meeting, not so much an effect. A couple more things. Sleep quality impairs mood as well. One reason is that poor or reduced sleep really impairs decision making and makes it difficult to control emotions. Poor sleep also impairs job satisfaction because people feel more irritable and less alert. It's really interesting to think about age in this context. One study of people aged 18 to 94 suggests that negative emotions seem to occur less as people get older. So this study implies emotional experience improves with age. As we get older, we experience fewer negative emotions. Probably my favorite part of this information. There's not a lot to look forward to as we age, and this actually might be one of them. And then finally, let's look at sex. Evidence confirms that women are more emotionally expressive than men. They experience emotions more intensely, tend to hold on to emotions longer than men, and display more frequent expressions of both positive and negative emotions, except for anger. One study has participants from 37 different countries. They found that men consistently report higher levels of powerful emotions like anger, whereas women report more powerless emotions like sadness and fear. So there are differences in the experience and expression of emotions. Obviously, there's a lot more room for work here as we move through generations and as we move through decades. I don't know, there might be biases in the research. I'd have to look a little bit more deeply into it, but again, a lot of these aren't absolutes. They're backed up from the research that we have at hand, and this would be a good place to continue more. All right, so let's move into the next part of our agenda, which focuses on the concept of emotional labor. We can define emotional labor as an employee's expression of organizationally desired emotions during interpersonal transactions at work. The term was coined by sociologist Arlie Hochschild in 1983, and the concept of emotional labor emerged from studies of service jobs. Again, really not surprising. You can think about this, for example, the way that airlines expect their flight attendants to be cheerful pretty much no matter what. Companies expect the same from those working in customer service roles. Emotional labor is actually relevant to just about every job, including yours and mine. At the very least, we are expected to be civilized to our coworkers, even when things are difficult. We are expected to be polite and have a modicum of decency no matter what, but real challenges arise when employees have to project one emotion while feeling another. And this is known as emotional dissidence. You've likely experienced this yourself. In the case of emotional dissidence, pent-up feelings of frustration and resentment easily lead to emotional exhaustion and burnout. So it becomes a real concern. We can perhaps best help employees if we can teach them to understand how to separate their emotions. Nothing really easy about this, but follow along with me. For example, they can be separated into what's known as felt emotions or just displayed emotions. Felt emotions are an individual's actual emotions. In contrast, displayed emotions are those the organization requires workers to show and considers necessary in a job. Displaying fake emotions require us to suppress the real ones. So that's what's known as surface acting. Surface acting is hiding inner feelings and foregoing emotional expressions in response to display rules. Someone who has to smile at a customer when they really don't feel like it is surface acting. And then deep acting, on the other hand, is trying to modify our true inner feelings based on display rules. Here would an example here would be a nurse trying to genuinely feel more empathy for her patients, and that's deep acting. So surface acting deals with displayed emotions and deep acting deals with felt emotions. And the important thing to realize here is that displaying emotions that people don't really feel, again, is exhausting, and it's important for us to find ways to give our employees a chance to relax and recharge. While we're in this section, we can also consider affective events theory. We know that employees react emotionally to things that happen to them at work, and this influences job performance and satisfaction. Emotions provide valuable insights into how workplace hassles and uplifting events influence employee performance and satisfaction. And emotions and the events that cause them should not be ignored at work because they, of course, accumulate, which brings us back to the point of the webinar. What is an emotional culture? How can we develop a really good one? Every organization has an emotional culture, even if it's one of suppression. So when managers ignore emotional culture, they're glossing over a vital part of what makes people and organizations tick. They might understand its importance in theory, but they can still shy away from emotions at work. Leaders often expect to influence how people think and behave on the job, but they themselves may feel ill-equipped to understand and actively manage how employees feel and express their emotions at work. So, what can organizations concretely do to make a difference? How can they establish and recognize a good emotional culture? Well, there's a few steps that they can take. There's quite a few, actually. Let me share with you a couple of them. They can genuinely recognize that emotions are a natural part of the workplace, and good management does not mean creating an emotion-free environment. To the contrary, it means embracing it to the extent that they can. They can provide positive feedback to increase the positivity of employees. We touched upon that earlier in the webinar. Of course, it also helps to hire people who are predisposed to positive moods. They can, especially in the service sector, encourage positive displays of emotion, which make customers feel more positive and thus improve on the whole customer service, customer relations, and interactions. And they can really understand the role of emotion and moods to significantly improve your ability to explain and predict your coworkers and others' behaviors. Okay, so to cultivate a particular emotional culture, you'll need to get people to feel the emotions valued by the organization or team and at least behave as if they do. So here are a couple of other methods. This information is directly borrowed from an article that appeared in the Harvard Business Review in 2016, and it was titled Manage Your Emotional Culture, written by Segal Barsad and Olivia O'Neill. Brilliant, brilliant work, very novel work with a lot of creativity and examples of cultures that they notice. So if you are interested in this particular topic, I would like to direct you to that particular publication. It's just very, very interesting. Okay, so what did Barsad and O'Neill say? Few suggestions. It's really important to understand that we should harness what people already feel. What is organically there? Some employees will experience the desired emotions quite naturally. This can happen in isolated moments of compassion or gratitude, for example. When such feelings arise regularly, that's a sign that you're building the culture you want. That's good. If people have them periodically and need help sustaining them, you can incorporate some gentle nudges to encourage those things during the workday. But what can you do about emotions that are toxic to the culture that you're striving for? How can you discourage these things when they already exist? Pretty difficult, but expecting people to put a lid on those feelings is not effective and usually destructive. The emotions will just come out later and in counterproductive ways. So it's important to listen to employees. Listen, but not to the extent to allow people to vent. Venting too much can really turn into a destructive force, but listening, gaining an understanding of what the employees are coping with is helpful. And you can maybe help them reframe or think about the situations in more constructive ways. This would involve coaching, exposure to emotional intelligence techniques and training, and a host of other training as well. Okay, this might seem obvious, but another suggestion is to model the emotions that you want to cultivate. The research on emotional contagion shows that people in groups, quote unquote, catch feelings from others through behavioral mimicry, as the authors say, and subsequent changes in brain function. If you regularly walk into a room smiling with high energy, you are much more likely to create a culture of joy than if you wear a natural expression. Negative feelings tend to spread like wildfire as well. Those are equally as contagious, if not more. If you frequently express frustration, that emotion will infect your team members and their team members and so on throughout the organization. So this is something very worthwhile to think about. And before you know it, then you'll just have your own culture of frustration company-wide. So consciously model the emotions that you want to cultivate in your company. And then finally, get people to fake it until they feel it. If employees don't experience the desired emotion at a particular moment, they can still help maintain their organization's emotional culture. Research has long shown that individuals tend to conform to group norms of emotional expression, imitating others out of desire to be liked, fitting in, and accepted. And so this can be a very powerful notion. Employees in a strong emotional culture who would not otherwise feel and express the value the value of emotion will begin to demonstrate it, even if their initial motivation is to be compliant rather to internalize the culture. So I hope that makes sense. That is essentially it. That's just a little bit of a primer into the world of moods and emotions. There's a lot of research in it. If you know of anyone that has an interest in this sort of thing, I would strongly suggest taking a look at it and seeing how they could maybe advance a lot of the research even further. I think that would be a very worthwhile endeavor. And I'm just going to put my sources up here because they were very helpful in assisting me in assembling this material for today. And so that is about it. Are there any questions?
Excellent. Thank you so much, Marianne. We do have a few questions that have come through. The first question that I do want to go ahead and ask you, when it comes to emotional culture, how do you manage that when working remotely during this pandemic? You're not always together. And then also a lot of times when we have to wear a mask at work, how do we model these positive emotions?
Yeah, great question. And it's interesting. I've heard a lot of stories. I've just been talking to people from a lot of organizations, how managers are handling the remoteness and the physical separation of not being together, and some are doing really well and some are just doing terribly. It's easy to forget people, and it's easy just to imagine that everyone is okay. And if a manager hasn't really imposed the discipline of a weekly meeting 2 or 3 days a week, a daily meeting, it's very easy to have those relationships erode very quickly. You probably even feel it with some of your friends. It's hard to stay in touch with people. You don't really want to bug them, and then you don't, there's some kind of a crazy thing going on where people are either just so bored, they don't have enough to do, and they're so lonely. And then on the other side, there are some that are just so overwhelmed. All of a sudden, their area of expertise seems to be needed, and they're just trying to keep their heads above water. I'm digressing a little bit, but you know, coming up with some sort of system, and not in a threatening way. You know, there's a level of trust with your team as well, that just because people are home doesn't mean that they're not working. But finding that balance of just even checking in for 15 minutes in the morning over a cup of coffee to maintain some semblance of having a workspace. I know we all want to get back to the campus. At least people in my group want to get back. We've lost a lot, and hopefully we've learned a lot too in terms of how to manage these things. But I guess, consistency in that regard is the key, and just making sure that those contacts exist. The second part, boy, it's hard to read emotion if you really can't see half of a person's face. I've actually encountered this in Wegmans, where people were just trying to be super nice, and you're kind of communicating through a mask. I think just in terms of body language, communicating, this is off the top of my head, but even communicating openness, keeping hands open rather than arms closed and so forth, and nodding and giving signals of affirmation, I think is probably just the best way to do that. It just takes a lot of extra compassion. I know we've all learned that. This all takes a lot more patience, kindness, and compassion just to help everyone feel comfortable and even to the extent that we can. I don't know if anyone else on the call has a suggestion. I don't know if you can, if you have that ability to kind of harness those, but if anyone else has a suggestion, I would love to hear that too.
Excellent. Thanks, Marianne. Yeah, anybody has suggestions, feel free to put them in the chat box and send those to us as well. Marianne, the next couple of questions, I'm going to take two similar questions and kind of bring them together maybe into one. They're very similar in a few ways. But going back to the weather, so for sunny versus cloudy, is that on average, or are there distinct groups that do better or worse depending on the weather? Also, too, sometimes we hear that weather changes or pressure fronts can often impact, migraine or joints or something like that. Any thoughts on that as well? Does the weather study take into account where you live?
Not the ones that I was looking at, but that's a good question. You'd have to say that Seattle, or even living in Buffalo, can be challenging because we just have so many gray days in a row. So I think that I don't know enough about the depth of the study. I'd be happy to look into it, and especially the one that my colleague was citing most recently. If it's possible, I could get it back to the audience. I'm afraid that my treatment of this here is a tad superficial. Let me see, hang on a second. Yeah, let me just see if I can get the source on that. And one second. Yeah, I know, it's very interesting. Mood and temperament. Yeah, I've got the name of the publication, but it came from a journal called Mood and Temperament, so I'm just gonna have to dig a little bit deeper to find that. I apologize.
That's all right, Marianne. We certainly, if you have any additional information you want us to send along to the group, we're happy to do so. But the next question that has come through, how can we assess the current emotional culture of our organization?
There are ways of doing that. The most basic way that you're probably most familiar with is through a 360 assessment. You can get a sense of the general climate holistically if you want to do that. There's also cultural assessments, and there are likely emotional culture assessments as well. That's something that people are prepared to come on in and survey if you have the inclination to do that. And like any survey, that would point you in the direction of things that needs improvement. I think that this issue is complicated because we're thinking about moods and emotions, and to a large degree, we probably all have our own feelings about them, like what they encompass. And I showed you a couple different models there. So how do you really capture these? What kinds of emotions are important for you to capture? There are experts that can actually be hired to help with that.
Great. Thank
So
you so much, Marianne.
I'll put that on my list to send recommendations as well of who might be good in the Western, well, people are from all over the country, right? Let me figure out a couple of consultants that could help with that.
Excellent. Thank you. The next question goes back towards your reference to what's the difference between fake it till you make it and ignoring the emotion entirely, which is supposed to be bad and not effective. What are your thoughts here?
Okay, it's that is the type of thing that if you reinforce, the positivity, um, that people will, even if they're not naturally inclined to do it, if you have an environment where you're emotionally intelligent, you've got an emotional culture, they will start to adapt. It's, first of all, I think I mentioned like just in terms of compliance, that is the norm in the organization. That's what people are doing, that it's more comfortable to comply with it and become a part of it as opposed to, kind of rejecting it or so forth. And the feeling here is, according to the authors, that if they see enough modeling, if they start to understand that this is really the makeup of the emotional culture, that they will start adopting it, because there's always assimilation wherever you work. You want to be part of the culture. It becomes second nature. Perhaps it's feeling forced and uncomfortable in the beginning, like don't make me smile, like I hate this feels unnatural. But if enough people are doing it, after a while they just start to understand it and invest in it. And the thinking here is, they will become part of that culture. That will have an effect on their presence and their demeanor in the workplace.
Excellent. All right, Marianne, the next question we have here, what is the distinction between emotion and attitude? Sometimes we think that the person just has a bad attitude, does not react well in certain situations. Any thoughts here?
Yeah, hang on a second. Let me just think about something. So if you want to get back into concepts, when you think about attitude, it's broken really into three different segments. There is cognitive evaluation, affective, which is closer to feeling, which is probably why this question is coming forward. And then there's like a behavioral action. So if you can think about it in three pieces, the cognitive equals the cognitive part of the attitude equals evaluation. So say, for example, you say that my supervisor gave me a promotion to my supervisor gave a promotion to a coworker who deserved it less than I did, so my supervisor is unfair. So that is your evaluation. That's the cognitive part of the attitude. That is not fair. The affective or feeling part, which is probably closer to what we're talking about here, is that you feel, I do not like my supervisor. That's how it manifests itself. And then thirdly, the behavioral part of the attitude translates into action. So you feel like, cognitively your supervisor is unfair. Effectively, you dislike your supervisor, and then behaviorally, you're going to look for another job. So there's three parts to that, and the middle part might be kind of close to what it is we're talking about here, but on the whole, attitude is different in its composition, and yeah, so slightly different concepts.
Great, thank you. Marianne, the next question we have here, what is the best way to approach a team who is otherwise hyper professional and emotions averse and encourage a collective nudge in a better direction?
Well, that, like anything comes from the top. Are they a subculture that's really just not comfortable participating in the emotional culture of the entire organization? By nudges, it means, could you maybe reframe the way that they have to feel so hyper professional that there's just no chance anyone can feel vulnerable? And I know that there's always a balance here too, but vulnerability can really go a long way into improving the emotional culture. And how you make people feel vulnerable means that there has to be a really high level of trust that always goes hand in hand. From some of the work that I read, it's like a gentle nudge could even be something like importing, giving the team some meditation techniques or a relaxation technique, or just a way to let them, give them a feeling of safety if a mistake is made. I hope I'm answering this properly, but little nudges are nudges of humanity, where people aren't always getting hammered to meet goals and so forth. There's room for, some affiliation. There's room for coaching. Coaching would go a long way in that particular situation, and really figuring out what it is that subculture needs and why it's not partaking in the general culture of the organization. I hope I'm answering that right. That's the way I interpreted the question.
Excellent, Marianne. Thank you so much. The next question comes from us from a participant. Does clothing play a part with emotions? They understand it displays maybe formality or approachability, but what about emotions and moods?
Clothing? Clothing and
Yep.
emotions and moods? That's the question? I don't know. Can clothing, I suppose it's the way that we express ourselves. And anytime that we derive joy from something, joy is a pretty contagious emotion. So again, thinking about this, if dressing up a certain way makes us feel better, that would most likely affect mood. I know that a lot of my students in my communication courses, they're not required to dress up. They're not required to dress up for the presentations, and they come in suits and ties anyway. And that might be part of it, just feeling, however you define that motion of being happier or feeling more confident as you're dressed up, might be a part of that. I have not seen any research on that. I'll have to take another look. It doesn't mean that there isn't any out there. It's a really cool idea.
Great, thank you. Marianne, we have another question here for you. Where does changing the inputs come into play? You spoke of wearing masks, the need to model better behavior, but how do we impact the causes of negative emotion to reduce the burden?
Well, if it's a toxic culture, there's a lot of ways of dealing with that. It's a lot of the work that we look at is, looking at bad apples, just how destructive a bad apple could be. There's work on cohesion. I don't know what's going on in the questioner's workplace, but there's a fascinating look at cohesion that if the work production goal is low, but cohesion is high, if you have a group that's really protecting each other, that is something that, immediately has to be dealt with. For example, it's a toxic culture, again, that all begins at the top. And it's if it's allowed to go on, that's a problem. Even if the senior leadership is performing beautifully, if problems of toxicity and negativity are still continuing, that is still senior leadership's responsibility. So that has to be identified. Is it a person? Is it a person in the wrong position? Whatever the cause of it might be, it really needs to be explored.
Thank you, Marianne. The next question, you mentioned you had a book that you would suggest, Manage Your Emotional Culture. Do you happen to have any other books or resource recommendations on emotional culture that would be helpful?
Yeah, I do. You know what, the best things to read about this are books on emotional intelligence. If the Goldman work on emotional intelligence is a really good place to start, because just inherently, and I stayed away from putting emotional intelligence in here because I feel like so many people now know so much about it, but the emotionally intelligent organization really encompasses a lot of what we just talked about for the last half hour. Knowing emotional intelligence requires empathy, emotional regulation, like not losing our temper, understanding what other people are going through, and all that kind of thing. So I would really direct the questioner to Goleman's work on emotional intelligence if you haven't read it yet, or anything surrounding that. That is really a good way to get a handle on this.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Marianne. That was the final question that we had here. So, really, on behalf of the Office of Alumni Engagement and the UB School of Management, I do want to say thank you for sharing your time, your knowledge, your research, and your expertise with us. As a reminder, we have recorded today's webinar, so we'll send you all the link within the next 24 hours. So, just keep an eye on your email inbox. Also, too, save the date. This coming Wednesday, June 10th, we'll be joined by Dean Jean Wachtowski, Wendy, PhD and Dean of UB School of Public Health and Health Professions, to learn about research taking place right here at UB that looks for ways to improve the health communities and populations, including COVID-19 studies and landmark, longitudinal study, and the Women's Health Initiative. So save the date this coming Wednesday. We'll also share this information in the follow-up email that you'll receive tomorrow. More information on all of our upcoming webinars, as well as our webinar archive library, can be found on our website, and we'll make sure you have that as well. With that said, I'll turn it back to Mary Ann for any closing remarks.
Okay, I just wanted to say thank you, everyone, for just being so gracious to spend some time here. I know these are incredibly busy days. I will get back to you to the extent I can. It's certainly on the weather research. I know where to get that one. I will get my hands on that and follow up with any other items that I can. But good luck to you. It's Monday, and your week is going to get better, as we just learned. So I look forward to seeing your webinars as well. If you do have an idea, participate. It's a wonderful way to really celebrate our UB community. And, we all learn something, and that's always a great gift. So again, thank you very, very much.
Excellent. Thank you again, Marianne. I know I have one final question that came through. I'll send that to you. We can get that answered, and we'll get that back out to the group as well. But I just want to say thank you again. Thank you all for joining us. We hope to see you on a future webinar. Let us know if you have a topic you'd like to submit for a webinar in the future. As Marianne mentioned, it's a great learning opportunity, lifelong learning and education here at UB. So thank you so much. Take care. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Christy. Thank you, Joy.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.